Buried in the Burley Municipal Airport information for runway 20 is a concise reason why the 4,092-foot runway had a threshold displaced by 305 feet. In one word, stack. That stack protruded 100 feet into the air directly along the flight path for the RNAV approach, straight into the runway. You'll be forgiven if you mistake that gray and red metal structure for killing Brittany. You won't even be entirely wrong. But there are two other reasons, both innocent enough in isolation: a haircut appointment and a runway inspection. The fatal accident occurred during the second approach. The first had terminated in a low-altitude flyby followed by a missed approach procedure. The 30-year-old pilot was running a load of UPS mail from Salt Lake City to Burley, Idaho, an unremarkable airport in a small town, uncontrolled with plenty of runway for anything this side of a swept-wing aircraft. The approach path for 20 was guarded from obstructions by the Snake River, yet on the opposite bank there was a potato processing plant, an Idaho staple, acres and acres and communities built on the backbone of agriculture. That processing plant needed exhaust stacks, and the Environmental Protection Agency needed them to be 100 feet tall. They built the stacks without consulting the airport or the FAA. Both became involved eventually, but by then it was too late. Idaho's potato country. The needs of small municipal airports come second to regional jobs. The pilots were going to have to keep an eye out while on final for the obstructions. The FAA tried to help. They instructed the processing plant to install anti-collision lights on the stacks to aid nighttime visibility for pilots. They also told them to paint the structures in high contrast orange and white to aid visibility during daylight. The plant installed the lights, but never painted the structures. We'll get back to that. Brittany was well thought of by her instructors and fellow aviators. She was a local. Her father had learned to fly with the owner of the Part 135 cargo carrier she flew Cessna Caravans for. This would make the tragedy doubly difficult for her bosses and peers. By all accounts, she was a competent pilot who had earned the respect of her fellow coworkers. The only equivocation from her instructors on the Caravan had been her relative inexperience, an inevitable complaint for a pilot with only 1,400 hours who was flying alone in the winter in a turbine single. The NTSB report partially blamed her for the accident. In template language, they wrote, "The pilot failed to maintain altitude during an instrument approach, which resulted in descent below the approach path and impact with the vent stack. Also causal was a failure of the processing plant to correctly paint the vent stacks. Sterilized. Cut and dry. Nothing more to say, except for the two things that could have prevented that second approach to the airport. The first was company policy, not written in the manuals but well known to the pilots. Burley Municipal Airport had limited ground services. In particular, there was no de-icing equipment. For this reason, pilots were expected to divert to Twin Falls Airport some 40 miles away when it was snowing in Burley. As proof that Brittany knew about the rule was a winter worksheet she had completed for her bosses months prior to the accident. Question 22 was horribly prophetic. You are flying from Salt Lake City to Burley. What is the course of action if Burley is snowing at the time of your arrival? Her handwritten answer? Divert Twin Falls, let ops know, and UPS drivers. Those UPS drivers were waiting for the Caravan to arrive before Brittany's first approach. They were sitting inside the airport manager's office when her first approach terminated in a low flyby. Landing from that approach is the second thing that could have prevented the crash, though the flyby in this case was compliant with company policy. Though the airport manager was present, runway conditions were not. The low flyby was to confirm that the runway condition was acceptable for landing. In this case, the runway was covered in a blanket of snow. If Brittany had deviated from policy and landed, likely none of us would know her name. She would have unloaded with UPS, brushed her wings off with a broom, and, maybe not smartly, but most likely, would have gotten back to Salt Lake City in time for her hairdresser's appointment, the one that she was anxious to keep according to a fellow pilot who was domiciled TDY in a Salt Lake City hotel with her. Days prior to the accident flight, Brittany had diverted to Twin Falls due to snow at Burley. She had inquired of her bosses whether that had been okay. They reported telling her that it was exactly what they wanted her to do. The policy wasn't there as a placeholder. The contract with UPS had a carve-out for just such a circumstance. The last thing management wanted was for a Caravan to get stuck in Burley due to a lack of de-icing, or worse, take the risk of departing with contaminants slung on the control surfaces. A bad idea in any aircraft, but particularly dangerous in the slowpoke Caravan. So it was with confusion when fellow pilots and managers were provided weather reports at Burley for the time of both approaches. Reduced visibility with falling snow. Brittany should have gone to Twin Falls, and she knew it. This represents an oddity of fortune. Had she entirely ignored policy, she would have dodged the fatal second approach. Had she defiantly adhered to the Burley specific snow restriction, she would have deferred to Twin Falls, missed her hairdresser's appointment, trading an NTSB probable cause for her life. It wasn't what killed her, but it's important to note before we get to what did. You'll be forgiven if you think a hairdresser's appointment is an inexcusable reason to tackle snow unprotected in a single-engine Cessna. Judgment's easy when the outcome's already known. But people make these sorts of risk exchanges every day. Late for a meeting? Speed. Guy cuts you off? Give him the finger assuming he isn't a madman with a gun. That dark spot on your skin? Probably nothing. Not worth a dermatologist visit for melanoma. The list is endless. If tragedy only counted in the face of perfect decisions, no one would weep at funerals. Sometimes, as is the case here, the decisions are so wildly disjointed from the consequences that the only thing left is cruel fate. Still, there was a specific cause for this crash. The RNAV approach was non-precision, meaning that the descent could be made at any reasonable rate to the minimum decision altitude, 4560 feet, which was 408 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. The Caravan that Brittany was flying was equipped with TKS anti-ice to keep deadly ice contaminants from accumulating on the leading edges of the airframe, the only places generally at risk during forward flight. The TKS fluid is heated antifreeze that is squeezed onto the forward portions of the aircraft through perforated holes. It is effective at keeping an aircraft aloft in snow, though the NTSB could not verify whether it was active during the final approach. Though the RNAV approach was non-precision, meaning that a stable descent on a depicted glide path was not provided by regulators, the Garmin G1000 avionics system in the Caravan could reproduce the 3.75-degree glide path for use with both the flight director and the autopilot. Though the depicted glide path is not officially sanctioned by the FAA for navigation, it's not hard to pick up on the fact that they prefer for pilots to use it when able. The accident rate is much higher for non-precision approaches utilizing steeper descents, which results in an aggressive level off at the minimum descent altitude. All too often, pilots forget to level off and fly into the ground short of the runway. A stable descent rate along a glide path takes the aircraft all the way to the runway surface. It's unclear the level of automation that Brittany intended to use on the approaches. The data points recorded by ADSB for the first approach are grouped tightly to the 3.75-degree final approach path from outside of the final approach point of Hicklow to the aircraft descending below the ADSB reception altitude around Jamid intersection. This would support the idea that the autopilot had been on and coupled to the Garmin-derived stable glide path. The second approach did not go as smoothly, likely for a few reasons. The first is that the steep 3.75-degree glide path was designed by regulators for the approach inside of Jamid intersection, which had been designed inside the final approach fix of Hicklow to provide a minimum crossing altitude that would protect aircraft from the stacked structures over the potato processing plant. Between Hicklow and Jamid, the altitudes were consistent with the normal 3-degree glide path. The G1000, to generate a stable final approach, extended the steeper 3.75-degree glide path beyond Jamid. This meant that if an aircraft is established on the glide path prior to Hicklow, as it was on the first approach, it'll pass above the minimum crossing altitude, which is acceptable. On the accident approach, a descent was initiated prior to Hicklow that resulted in the aircraft never intercepting the 3.75-degree glide path. This appears to have resulted in the Caravan capturing the minimum crossing altitude of 6,000 feet and maintaining that altitude as it flew past the 3.75-degree intercept. The descent from this point would have either been manually flown by the pilot or commanded via another pitch mode such as vertical speed, where the pilot manually selects the descent rate for the aircraft. As the aircraft approached Jamid intersection, the descent rate increased and the vertical trajectory crossed below the 3.75-degree glide path, though it was not far below the minimum crossing altitude at Jamid. However, after this, the aircraft continued on a steeper than programmed final approach path. Given weather reports at the time, Brittany would have had visual contact with the ground during this period, but the steep descent between Hicklow and Jamid necessitated a reduced power setting in order to maintain approach airspeed. It appears, once inside of Jamid, that this reduced power setting was not increased to that needed for a stable 3.75-degree glide path. This simultaneously led to a steeper descent path as well as a degradation in airspeed. The Caravan was quickly running out of energy, and it was quickly closing in on the 100-foot obstacle that defended the Snake River from the airport. The FAA utilized an exemplar of the Caravan cockpit to determine what Brittany would have seen above the glare shield while on final approach given the ADSB data. They determined that the exhaust stacks would have been below her line of sight until mere seconds prior to impact. The outcome was devastating. The 30-year-old life of a woman with a wanderlust for aviation terminated in a chaos of aluminum and steel. The lessons, as they often are confounded by the multiverse of possibilities. Follow the letter of the law? Live. Deny it altogether? Probably live. Painted exhaust stacks? Maybe she would have been more aware of the earlier flights that they were there. Live. Intercept the glide path at 6,600 feet outside of Hicklow? Live. 1,000 more hours of experience? Live. The only place more apparent than in aviation how fickle life is a war zone. God bless her. Stay safe.